Fly me to
Yeah, so I
Washington.
can
Okay.
Please. Let's do that.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Solid strategy.
Solid.
I think.
Right.
And then you can get rid of
And
the
then
blues next time.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah.
next
Oh,
time.
next time. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
just getting in position.
Good for you.
Two
All right.
cards.
Yes.
Every Thursday afternoon, a group of women in their 60s gathers in Riverside, California to play a board game.
Yeah.
Ooh, stop the next
Already.
Infect City step. Do not flip over
Oh,
any infection
great.
cards.
Okay, so we don't have to flip over for
Yay!
this one.
Okay.
Oh, so it's important to
Oops.
pick
And
those
then I
out before
use
we
it.
do
Discard.
It's for everyone. Okay, but so we don't.
Some retirees getting together for a game of Scrabble or a round of Mahjong may not seem unusual. But here in Riverside, these women are doing something different. They are participating in a scientific study to find out how aging affects our ability to learn and what we might do to keep learning even late in our lives.
Cool. All right, everybody ready?
Yes.
Everybody good? Okay, so thank you for coming to the study.
Dr. Rachel Wu is a psychology professor at the University of California, Riverside.
The overall question is, how can we best motivate adults, especially older adults, to be learning new things that are kind of outside of their comfort zone?
And she's found something surprising.
Adults are much better learners than kids. It's just that we get in our own way. We keep ourselves from learning well.
Because we just don't think we can because we're too old.
Because we don't think we can, but also because adults learning is special because of all of this experience that you're bringing in.
Dr. Wu and her team are challenging the conventional wisdom about growing old, that aging simply wears out our brains so that we can't pick up new things like we did when we were young. And it's true that, generally speaking, we start having memory lapses as we age. It becomes harder to retrieve a name or remember where we left the keys. But do these slips mean our days of learning are over? Not necessarily. In fact, we can not only preserve our cognitive abilities as we age, but enhance them. I'm Carl Zimmer, and in this episode of The World as You'll Know It, we'll explore what really happens to our brains as we age. And we'll learn what it took for adults over 55 to perform like 22-year-olds on cognitive tests. Each week, Dr. Wu's volunteers play a different board game. When we visited, they were breaking out a game called Pandemic. Dr. Wu's assistant, Genevieve Monda, explained the rules.
So, Pandemic is, it's a collaborative game. So the concept is there's 4 diseases. We're all going to have 4 separate roles. And then we all have to work together to find the cures for the diseases.
Pandemic was a little harder than the game they played the previous week, Century Spice Road.
So this is your reference card. These are like your action cards. Remember how in Century Spice you had these were the actions that you can do? It's similar to that kind of way.
Let's just play that game.
I know, that was fun, huh?
So it's kind of like a card in Monopoly.
In this study, Wu and her team are exploring how best to motivate older adults to learn new things. Her theory is it's not that our brains are no longer capable of learning. Rather, there are psychological and social obstacles that get in our way. In general, Wu's research has shown that not only can older people learn to do new, complex tasks, but they can learn to do several of them at once. In one of her studies, a group of volunteers ranging in age from 58 to 86 attended classes in 3 subjects that were new to them. For 3 months, they studied things like painting, Spanish, and music composition. The idea was to teach them the way we teach kids, throwing lots of things at them at once.
We wanted to see the level of challenge that children get when they're learning 5 new things at the same time. We wanted to give adults and older adults especially this level of challenge.
When you were looking for the results to see if it actually helped, what kind of markers were you looking for?
So the biggest marker that everybody cares about is their cognitive abilities. So we're talking about your ability to remember a string of digits or your ability to switch between different tasks, remember a list of words and things like that. So that was our main marker. So we had a bunch of different cognitive tests that we would later then combine into one score, and we would track them over time. So we tested them before the intervention, in the middle of the intervention, when the intervention ended, and then 3 months, 6 months, and 1 year after the intervention.
As a comparison, Wu's team also tested a number of people who were not in the study. They administered the cognitive test to students in their early 20s, workers in their 40s, and older adults in their 70s.
So we have benchmarks for where you might be if you're an average younger adult, older adult, and middle-aged adult. So over time, the older adults in our intervention went from the average older adult range from their level to middle-aged adults by the end of the intervention. And then 1 year after the end of the intervention, they were similar to the younger adults, so the 22-year-olds on campus.
This was a huge surprise. The participants improved their overall cognition. And not only that, those improvements continued long after the study was over, until the volunteers were performing on certain tests like 22-year-olds. Why do you think the benefit just keeps coming? I mean, once you're done with class, why would you keep seeing that improvement?
At the end of the intervention, a lot of people had come to us, and this is all anecdotal. They were telling us, like, we can do anything. We learned all these things we had no idea we could actually even attempt to do. So one person said, I'm going to go finish my undergraduate degree. Another person said, I want to go learn guitar. And so it gave them the confidence to do things that they didn't think that they could do because they didn't think that they could learn or make time for it.
Dr. Wu's research pushes back against the stereotypes about what our brains can or can't do as we get old. But the idea that old brains don't work as well as young ones didn't come out of nowhere. The fact is that brains do change as we age. And if you're an older person, it's hard not to notice that your brain doesn't exactly perform like it used to.
A lot of people talk about the brain. If you uncrinkled it all, you'd have like a big pizza, right? Just like a pizza, it has depth to it. And so we do see that those layers start to thin a little bit. And that we can see like even as early as your 30s. That is probably the first change that we see.
Cindy Lustig is a psychologist and neuroscientist at the University of Michigan. She studies how the brain's anatomy and chemistry change with age. And a lot of these changes do seem worrisome. For example, as parts of the brain shrink, they lose some of the protective coating on their neurons.
The way I usually describe it, it's like having insulation on a wire. Once you build up the insulation, then those electrochemical signals can travel really quickly down the axon and communicate well. When we age, unfortunately, that stuff is the most vulnerable to aging, and they start to deteriorate. So it's just like if you've ever had a set of headphones and, they have that plastic coating on them, and let's say you use them a lot, you go to the gym and so on, you get a little nick in the coating. Well, the headphones still work, but you have a lot of static in them, and they don't work quite as well.
So how does that translate into how our thought processes work if we've got this fraying insulation as we're getting older?
It tends to be slower and noisier. Those are the things that we notice the most.
That explains it. Lustig says that some of the regions of the brain most vulnerable to this loss, like the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, are crucial for planning, attention, and forming short-term memories.
Especially when that's happening in these frontal regions that are really responsible for us being able to say, oh, this is the information that is relevant in the world. This is the information that's not as relevant in the world. If your brain is having a harder time distinguishing between those, basically your signal to noise ratio, we call it, from an engineering perspective, that ratio goes down. You get more and more noise in the system. It starts to have fuzzier representations. Fuzzier representations are harder to remember. They're slower to process, and so on and so forth.
And so these parts in the front of the brain, since they're important for decision-making and you've got that noise issue, that's going to make it more difficult to make fast decisions?
Right. So a lot of us notice when we're younger and we're driving, right, we're very fast to make decisions. We're probably a little bit more fearless than we should be. As we get older, we drive more slowly. A lot of older adults really hate making a left turn, because it's like, oh, I have to process a lot of information. I have to process what's coming at me in this lane and that lane. And I also have to turn the thing. And so that overload of information and having to process it quickly becomes very stressful for people sometimes.
Now, when our brains get older, they don't just change in these kind of physical ways you described, but there are also chemical changes that occur as well. What are some of those changes?
So we have a whole group of neurotransmitters, and unfortunately, the news is not good for any of them as a result of aging. I'm sorry to say. So some of the ones that people really focus on, dopamine is probably, it's like the Beyonce of neurotransmitters. It's the one everybody knows about. And so, is very involved in our motivation and energizing and in learning and memory. One of the ones that I tend to study is acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is really involved in sort of sharpening representations and determining when you're going to focus in on something versus when you're going to take a wider perspective. And it works that way throughout the brain. Serotonin is another one. We often think of that in conjunction with mood. And norepinephrine is basically related to adrenaline and our ability to get aroused and excited, which again, we tend to do a little bit less of as we get older.
As our levels of brain chemicals change with age, they can change how we behave. For example, when dopamine drops, we may become more risk averse because we have less excitement about the upsides of a risk. And less acetylcholine makes it harder to focus on a particular fact. The memories are still there, but it takes longer to recall them. But what our brains lose over time is just one part of the story. There's a lot here you're talking about which makes you feel kind of bleak about getting older. Fraying insulation wires and chemicals misfiring. What is the secret of people who are, aging more successfully, who are still having a higher cognitive level?
Let me twist your question just a little bit.
Sure.
Because I do also want to emphasize that even for normal aging, not all changes are negative. So one of the things that we maintain and, just get better at because of our experience is our vocabulary and our language use. One of the first things that I often do when I am hiring new research assistants for my lab is I give them the same vocabulary test that I give to our older adult participants. And I have them take it and score themselves. And then I show them the average older adult score so that I remind them to be humble.
Wow.
And respectful of our older adults, because our older adults really just beat the pants off the young adults with that. And that's, University of Michigan students, so these are no dummies. The other thing is that we also get much better at controlling our emotions. So even though older adults sometimes have more difficulty controlling their attention and avoiding distraction, they also seem to be much more skilled than young adults are at when there's negative information, being able to direct their attention away from it and being able to direct their attention towards positive information. My dad has a saying, 100 years from now, nobody's going to know the difference. And I think that's very much an older adult perspective on things to take.
Some of the most surprising discoveries about aging brains have come from studies in which older people lie in MRI scanners and carry out cognitive tasks. The scanners measure blood flow in their brains to detect which parts are becoming active and which stay quiet.
It used to be that what people really would focus on was older adults having less activity in a certain brain area.
So their brain would be getting quieter in some regions.
Yeah, so the brain would be getting quieter. And then as we got more sophisticated tools and asked more sophisticated questions, what we started noticing is that, yes, that's true sometimes and in some areas, but then also, let's say if young adults will show a really big activation in this left frontal aspect of their brain when they're processing words and like thinking about language, older adults are maybe showing a little bit less there, but if we change the task, we can get them to bump it up. And then oftentimes they will also show this other activation on the right side that's in sort of like this very similar region over on the right side. It's almost like, okay, my left hand has gotten a little bit weaker, so I bring the right one in to help it along.
These discoveries led researchers to develop a new way of thinking about the aging brain. It's called scaffolding theory. The idea is that we build new pathways through the brain to carry out cognitive tasks. If one route is slowing down, we can take another one.
So you can think about things like the knowledge that you have built up over time Maybe if you can't immediately solve a problem in the moment, maybe you don't have to because you have the experience and you're just able to rely on that experience. So the idea is that we have these underlying structures and supports. So it's kind of building that structure in order to help you develop, or using that structure as something to sort of lean back on and help you preserve your function.
So as people are getting older, they may not necessarily go into this sort of cognitive decline because they've got some scaffolding that is going to support them in their old age?
Yeah, and so this is one of the reasons why, let's say, education and so on seem to be associated with this interesting pattern. So even if, let's say, they have the brain disease that's underlying dementia, people who are very highly educated often will be able to keep up their functioning for a longer period of time because they have these sort of fallbacks and experience and other ways of working around a problem. And so they're much better able to sort of fall back on that aspect and use that to disguise or overcome the issues that they might have that are based on purely the biology aspects of it. If you're staying engaged with active learning, then that really seems to keep that system going. So, the Sudoku and so on is fine, but it's maybe not as helpful as pushing yourself a little bit further to learn a new skill. There's some really fun studies that people have done with juggling, showing that you can actually see structural changes in the brain after you train people for a couple weeks in juggling.
Mhm.
So we don't have as good of an ability to sort of build up new neural scaffolding when we're older as we do when we're younger, but we haven't lost it. And so the more that we can keep using it, the less of it we will lose, basically.
Now, if I learn how to speak Spanish, do these things transfer? I mean, do I just get better at speaking Spanish, or is that going to be helping me in other kinds of cognition as I get older?
That is a really controversial question.
Mm.
When people have done the very focused training studies in the lab, an issue that we often see there is that we get what we call near transfer. You'll show improvement on that task and you'll show improvement on some things that are very similar to it, but it might be difficult to show the transfer out to, remembering your grocery list or driving the car and so on. In the real world, if you're learning the language, but you're also learning it with a group of people, and now you're also getting the additional social interactions. Well, social interactions are also a cognitive exercise, right? So holding a conversation, you have to remember things. You have to process what the other person is saying. You have to formulate your own response. They're more complex interventions, so they can be frustrating for us as scientists to figure out because we want to know, what is the thing or the three things causing these effects?
For Rachel Wu, the question of how the brain is changing on a structural level is in some ways academic. What Wu is really interested in is helping adults learn how to adapt to new situations, essentially helping them with the kind of transference from one cognitive task to others that Lustig was talking about.
Let's say you need to learn how to use your online platform for booking a doctor's appointment. So you've just learned how to play a new board game, and you've learned that YouTube has tutorials on how to play new board games. Then maybe you could Google and look for tutorials on how to use the online platform. So there are things that could translate that are about learning how to learn as opposed to the basic cognitive abilities themselves, right? Because people can remember 10 digits in a row, great. But if they can't book their own doctor's appointment or if they can't handle their own money, it doesn't matter that you can remember 10 digits in a row.
It's like freebies.
That's good.
So now it is your turn
Okay,
to
so
cure
first-
the disease.
And that counts as a turn, right?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to automatically remove cubes with the cure disease from the city
You're gonna
I
turn
am
them
in.
for,
So yellow is
four-
going.
Okay, so
Dr. Wu doesn't have the final results from her board game study yet. But when we paid a visit to the volunteers playing Pandemic, they said they were already feeling the benefits.
I had been wanting to do this decking in my yard, and I took the day. I had already bought the miter saw, set it all up, had a friend show me how to use it. So that day that day I went out, cut all my boards, put them all out there. I'm like, oh, this is awesome. I'm like, okay, I might want a router next. I can do this.
But it's not that they are learning in spite of their age. They say the ease of learning is because of it.
I feel like it's easier to learn now. Now I know everything has a certain process to it. And, nothing just happens to happen. There is a process you can put into place to make it easier.
I might be more deliberate in my learning now, and I think from experience have learned that when I am learning something, I do what I probably should have done when I was younger, is actually take notes as I'm reading versus just reading and think I'm going to absorb it. So I think that might be just experience that has helped me take that discipline and actually use it.
And you have time. There's no deadlines. I mean, you're learning it on your own. No one's expecting anything. So there's a lot less stress of, I have this deadline to meet. How do I use this form?
That sounds great. It sounds lovely.
It is wonderful. It's better than you ever thought.
There's another benefit to our brains getting older, an important one. We get wiser. This might seem like some unprovable cliche, but there is scientific evidence showing this is true.
I was always skeptical as to whether people got wiser when they got older. I was never blown away by someone's wisdom who was older. I was wrong, as you'll see. That was my skepticism.
Dr. Richard Nisbett is professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Michigan, and he's investigated how wisdom changes with age. It's surprising to think that there even could be a serious scientific inquiry of wisdom. I mean, it seems like a cultural concept, something that we talk about, but not necessarily something you could quantify and track and even do experiments with. What is wisdom from a scientific perspective?
So we measure dialectical reasoning, holistic reasoning. That's the proxy for wise reasoning.
Dialectical reasoning involves accepting contradictions while solving a problem and acknowledging that what seems true now may change later. Holistic reasoning involves stepping back and taking in the context of a problem.
The wise approach is to consider the perspective of all the parties involved, recognize the likelihood that if there's a dispute or a conflict, it's probably going to change. It's not going to be static. Recognizing that there can be many different kinds of possibilities as to how the conflict can unfold. And the dialectical mind recognizes the limits of its own knowledge. It acknowledges uncertainty. That's one sense in getting older, you can't live for a long time without understanding, oh my God, things change like mad.
In 2010, Nisbett and his colleagues ran a study to determine whether or not wisdom increases with age. They brought together over 200 volunteers who ranged in age from 20-somethings to people in their 80s. Some were high school graduates, others had advanced degrees. So you recruit these hundreds of people, and then what do you have them do?
Well, we have them read about conflicts, several interpersonal conflicts, and several intergroup conflicts.
What would be like an example of these different conflicts?
Well, our interpersonal conflict, we actually used Dear Abby problems.
The advice columnist.
That's right.
Oh, boy.
She's got some great ones.
In one trial, Nisbett and his colleagues borrowed a Dear Abby question from a woman who was frustrated with her in-laws. Her sister-in-law had bought an expensive headstone for her parents without consulting her family, and now she wanted everyone to help pay for it. Other questions were less personal. They involved big groups of people. For example, some of the study participants read about a Central Asian country where people were divided about whether to welcome immigrants.
So we have them look at these problems, and then we say, tell me what you think's going to happen.
The researchers scored the volunteers' answers according to how wise they were. High scores were given if the volunteers considered the perspective of all the people in the conflict, recognized the limits of their own knowledge, and believed that people and circumstances can change. When Nisbett's team added up the scores, they found that participants over the age of 60 consistently scored much higher than young and middle-aged participants. But age isn't the only thing that can contribute to wisdom. Culture is important too. Nisbett's team repeated the study in Japan and found that young Japanese people were wiser than young Americans, but they didn't become wiser as they got older. Nisbett says that more research on wisdom is needed to better understand how it correlates with aging. So do you think about that process with aging Americans as learning? Is that the kind of category of thought that's happening that makes people get wiser as they get older?
Right. It's just learning. I mean, it's learning strategies, conflict avoidance, conflict resolution, and learning things like the world changes.
All of this tracks with Dr. Wu's findings about the differences between how children and adults learn.
So one of my theories is like adults are actually better learners than kids because as long as we don't get in our way, we can actually learn quite quickly, quite efficiently. Kids waste a lot of time.
Dr. Wu is only in her 40s, but she's been taking her own medicine for years now. Back in her 20s, while she was still working on her PhD, she decided to take up painting. And people kept telling her she was just too old.
I would hear people tell me, oh, you don't have the talent for this, stop wasting your time. And these are people that meant well, right? And they wanted me to succeed in life. And then it got me thinking, well, we don't tell babies to stop wasting their time learning how to walk. I don't think you're going to be a good walker. You're just falling too much. And
you should just specialize in throwing food on the floor and just leave
right,
it at
exactly.
that.
And then I got good teachers. I spent 3 hours at least at the easel, at least once a week, and then as often as I could. But what happened was I started getting better, and especially with the help of the teachers that were really supportive, I started getting a lot better. And then I went back to the people that had told me these things before, and they were like, oh, you've unearthed this talent that you never knew you had, And so they attributed all the work that I had put in to something innate.
Wu has made learning new skills a regular part of her life as she grows older. And she says that every time she picks up something new, she sees the same pattern.
So then I started learning how to play the piano and sing. And then people were like, you're so tone deaf and, you're wasting your time. And then a few years later, they were like, wow, you've got a musical ear. You're so talented. You should quit your day job, right? And so every time I just started seeing the pattern. So there are a lot of issues and barriers that kind of keep you from succeeding in learning as an adult. And so I thought about these when I was learning, and then we started interviewing older adults to see if these were similar barriers that they would have. And lo and behold, these are the same barriers that they also face and much more. So it really got us thinking, what if cognitive decline, or a lot of what we see in terms of cognitive decline in the real world, is kind of self-imposed by these societal expectations and these messages that we give to ourselves and to other adults, that learning is not for you.
From both her personal and professional experience, Wu is confident that the outlook for the aging brain doesn't have to be bleak.
I have been pleasantly surprised how much of what we think of as decline is actually something that is dependent on activities that we do. At first, when I started doing this, I wasn't sure what was possible. From the literature, it seemed like, you hit a ceiling and then that's it. So you could maybe learn one thing at a time and maybe you can maintain your abilities. But if you think about maintenance, you would never keep a first grader in first grade if they could actually go to second grade, right? And so we talk a lot about maintenance for older adults as a goal. And what I want to talk about more is thriving and growth. What we've been showing is that not only can you maintain, you can grow, you can learn things that you never thought you could learn. Yeah, so it's a much more optimistic angle.
On the next episode of The World as You'll Know It.
If you look in the brains of healthy people, 30% of them, they'll have deposits of amyloid that could be diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease.
When a single dominant idea takes hold in the field, it becomes easier to reinforce that idea because it becomes the conventional wisdom.
What's going to happen if we don't make some big strides on Alzheimer's?
It's going to bankrupt families. It's going to bankrupt healthcare systems. Millions of people are going to be in nursing homes.
The World as You'll Know It, The Future of Aging, is brought to you by Aventine, a nonprofit research institute creating and sharing work that explores how today's decisions could affect the future. The views expressed don't necessarily reflect those of Aventine, its employees, or affiliates. For a transcript of the episode and more resources related to what you just heard, please visit aventine.org/podcast. Danielle Mattoon is the executive director of Aventine. Bruce Headlam is the editorial director of Aventine. Our show is produced by Emerald O'Brien and me, Carl Zimmer. Our associate producer is Maria Alexa Kavanaugh. Our editor is Joel Lovell. Camila Kashani is our managing producer. This episode was mixed by Marina Pais. Our head of sound and engineering is Raj Makija. Our senior recording engineers are Marina Pais and Pedro Alvira. Fact-checking by Will Tavlin. Original music by Davey Sumner. Music licensing by Epidemic Sound. Our executive producer is Asha Saluja. Additional production from Stephen Key. I'm your host, Carl Zimmer. Make sure to listen to us on the Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcasts.